So thank you all for coming. I hope not just for the croissants, but also for this very inspiring talk that we are hoping to see here. And yeah, for that I'll give the word to you, Anna. So take it away.
Thank you all so much for coming. I hope you had a lovely breakfast, some nice croissants, and I hope you're raring to go. So I know you're all from different backgrounds, but I'm sure you've all had an experience like this, where you put a lot of time and effort into designing or building something, and it was a lot of hard work, but it's finally launched, and it looks amazing. It's a work of art. And the boss is happy and you're so proud and you show it off, and then you have to move on to the next thing. Then a few months later, some new designers and developers, they come in and they make some little adjustments to your work. They use styles that don't fit with the content, and maybe they add huge images or lots of JavaScript that really slow the thing down. And it ends up looking terrible. And maybe you're embarrassed to put your name on it anymore. But whose fault is this? The next person who works on your project, they're not a mind reader. They're not going to know why you've made certain decisions. If they're very new, they might not even know about best practices like optimizing images or why it's bad to use lots of different web fonts. That's why we create documentation. Explaining where and when different pieces of content should be used forces you to think about your app or your site as a system rather than a series of screens. And the act of writing it also forces you to think about why you're doing things in a certain way, and this is where style guides come in. Style guides are a type of documentation that encourages people, be they designers, developers, or content producers, to follow a set of rules to help maintain consistency. And there are actually many different types of style guide, which I'll briefly walk you through. So you've probably all seen branding guidelines. These often go into obsessive detail about logo placement, color usage, and typography. They're not that helpful to digital products because they usually are entirely geared towards print, with the white space around the logo unhelpfully noted in millimeters and the color scheme in Pantones, and that just doesn't translate well to screens. Then there are print guidelines which go into even more detail. And this is one of many of the UK National Health Service's print materials. It's important for an organisation like the National Health Service to have these so that people trust the message that's being communicated, and also to make sure that the design is created in a way that is accessible to as many people as possible. With any organisation this big, it's quite common for these guidelines to be ignored, which is bad if you're trying to communicate a message that could be the difference between life and death. I want to be sure that this defibrillator is going to work when I use it, and having such a playful font, I just worry about what I'm going to find when I open that box. Content guidelines focus on the way in which it's appropriate to communicate. So when you've got lots of people working on a project, it's important that you sound consistent with the brand. So a company called MailChimp, they have their own guidelines, which they called voice and tone. And their recommended message for a success dialogue box is, fine piece of work, you totally deserve a raise. And it fits in with the playfulness of MailChimp's brand. That tone of voice is likely to be very different to the way that your bank tells you that your payment has gone through. Content guidelines also help keep language consistent with the house style, from whether a word such as email should have a hyphen in it to what overused phrases to avoid. So the Guardian and Observer's style guide was the first to appear publicly on the web. These newspapers, they have a lot of journalists, and they wanted to make it as easy as possible for them to check the style guide, whether they're writing a story at their desk or if they're on the road. We have similar guidelines for code as well. When there are multiple developers working on the same project, it's good to maintain a consistent style to the way that you write code to avoid conflicts and make it easier for everyone to know where things live. And finally, there are style guides built specifically for websites, which I refer to as front-end style guides. And these are what I'll be focusing on today. And they'll often contain a mixture of all of the ones I just showed you. Unlike a regular style guide, they're interactive. You can hover over a link and it will change state, and you can highlight the text. It's like an instruction manual for building and maintaining a specific website. There isn't a specific type of front-end style guide that is going to fit every project. There are many different techniques for building up a style guide for the web, and I'm going to start by showing you a couple of techniques that are aimed specifically at designers alongside front-end style guides. And this is because front-end style guides need investment from designers to be useful, so I'm going to be showing you these to help sell the idea to the rest of your team. If you have an existing site that you want to create a style guide from, or just to consolidate styles, the first thing that you can try is something called an interface inventory. And Brad Frost came up with the term, and to demonstrate it, he went to his bank's website, and very simply, he took screenshots of all the different styles of buttons on the website that he could find. And there are dozens, and this is just for one site, one brand. Imagine how much CSS there is just for these button styles. So an interface inventory is really easy to do. You're basically going to go through the site or the app and gather as many different styles as possible and group them by function like buttons and put them all in a slide deck. But don't just stop at buttons. You can also create inventories of all of these different sort of elements. If you're trying to convince someone of the value of creating a style guide, do a quick interface inventory just to highlight how much could be consolidated. Explain that consolidating these styles will help make the code leaner and the site more visually coherent and easier to maintain. This is only practical for an existing product, but let's say you want to start from scratch or completely revamp a current design. So Samantha Warren, she is a designer with a background in art, and she quickly realised that creating beautiful website mock-ups at the start of a project and presenting them to the client was a waste of time, because sometimes the visual style that she came up with was completely not what the client was hoping for. But it wasn't until she'd shown them something that they really started talking about what they did want. So she was trying to think of a way to facilitate this conversation about a design without creating a pixel-perfect mock-up. She then tried creating mood boards for clients, mood boards like you would get for interior design. But she found them too abstract at all. They felt too disconnected from a website, and clients would often already have a mood board made as part of a rebranding exercise. So she created style tiles. These are in between mood boards and mock-ups. They contain snippets of design elements, but they're not presented like a website. It's meant as a tool for conversation rather than a fixed deliverable. And they're less risky than presenting a finished comp to a client, since they're quick to make and you can create a few for the client to choose from and ask them, is this the impression that you're going for? And they remove that dangerous big reveal stage of a project where the client takes one look at your hard work and says, that's not us at all. So here's how a style tile is put together. So the most important aspect of a style tile are these words that are used to describe the feeling that the design should evoke. And each tile has different words. So one might say conservative, whereas another one might say modern. And these words influence the typography that's chosen, which is also different for each tile. And there are some small design snippets to give a very rough idea of what each design is meant to evoke. And the colour palette is shown. And finally, each style tile has a version number. After coming up with the style tile that the client liked, Samantha was then able to work on a mock-up incorporating these styles, and this is what it looks like. You can even use a chosen tile to form the beginnings of your front-end style guide before the bulk of the design work has even started. Dan Moore has a very similar approach called element collages, and like style tiles, they're a tool for facilitating conversations. but they come a little bit further along in the design process, or even straight after a style tile has been created. And here's what one looks like. So it's not a mock-up of a page, it's a digital scrapbook of ideas. And here Dan is prototyping some styles for how the buttons will work and how the donation fields will look. And this technique is perfect for designers who aren't yet comfortable putting their designs straight into code, but want to move away from doing full comps. The most valuable thing that element collages do is they focus the client on how that feature will work regardless of what size screen it's on. And now that we have an infinite number of devices and screen sizes and resolutions to worry about, breaking out of the canvas entirely helps the designer and the client to think more about how something is going to work in the context of the site or app as a whole, rather than on a specific screen. Design agency Clearleft, they've been trying out element collages in their design phase, and one problem that they encountered though was their explorations were looking too much like pages, and the client didn't really understand what it was that they were being shown. As you can see in this collage, although the various modules shown wouldn't all be found on the same page, it still looks too website-like. So they found a better way to present the element collage was on a wide horizontal canvas rather than a long vertical one. So this is an element collage that John Azelwood of Clearleft made. He built it for Code for America. And he's thinking about how to style the block quotes. And here he's toying with two very different styles that he's going to ask the client about to see which they prefer. Style prototypes are the next step along. They're basically element collages, but in code. And they skip the sitting in Photoshop phase and enable you to mock up something really quickly for feedback. So their prototypes are some of the content elements on the page, but these are all mocked up in HTML rather than Photoshop. So they adapt to different screen widths, and you can try it in the environment that it's designed for. And this gives a much more realistic impression of what the finished thing will feel like to use. So I build style prototypes in practically every project. The designer only has to use Photoshop for assets like icons. And the rest of the time they're handing me sketches, which I roughly mock up, they tweak, and that gets presented to the stakeholder. And this is an ideal approach if you have a hybrid designer and developer on your team. The code doesn't have to be great, it's a prototype after all. It's best to start building them during the design phase, so it might seem strange to start coding so early on in the project, but it means that you can test out ideas quickly before writing proper code. So you might already maintain a code standards document. So Harry Roberts, he's a front-end developer who has his own CSS guidelines, and it's been so popular that he's created an entire site for it. CSS guidelines are just one example. They could be written in HTML, PHP, basically whatever language is used on the site. And ideally they need to be written before you start building, but you can adapt someone else's so you don't have to do the bulk of the work. In Harry's CSS guidelines, it contains not just how to format CSS in a consistent way, but why it should be done in this way. Coding standards should evolve over time in response to changes in specifications and accessibility best practices. A good set of guidelines will tell you what to do, so keep selectors as short as possible. A great set of guidelines will tell you why, so keep selectors as short as possible in order to keep specificity down and performance up. And an excellent set of guidelines will go one step further and back up the reasoning with further reading. And this is invaluable for new developers working on your team because it helps them to learn best practices. If you're at a more stable part of the project where you're building out components, and then something called a pattern primer, which is a term Jeremy Keith of Clearleft that he likes to use, that's going to be more useful as an ongoing piece of documentation. This is the main type of style guide I'm going to be diving into, as the idea is it's not a throwaway deliverable, it's a system, it's a living, breathing, evolving library of components. Each component or module, each small piece of the design is referred to as a pattern. And they're like Lego blocks. They're independent of each other and can live on their own alongside other patterns to form pages. In this quote, Jeremy likes to use the term pattern library. A pattern primer is a pattern library. It's just what Jeremy likes to call his. And I think of a pattern library as a part of a front-end style guide, which might also include code standards and content guidelines. So anything that's going to help someone to maintain a site. Before Natalie Down co-founded Lanyard, she was a front-end developer at Clearleft, and when she was developing a new pattern, she'd add it to a long page which had all the patterns on it. And she called this a pattern portfolio. And this is where Jeremy's primer evolved from. The difference between Natalie's version and Jeremy's is that Jeremy separates the patterns from the page template and shows a markup alongside the pattern. And pattern libraries are built using the same markup and the same styles as the live site to keep it as accurate a representation as possible of the site. But this is not the only deliverable that Jeremy gives to a client. He'll also mock up a few pages, but with the intention that the client can use the pattern library to assemble new pages themselves going forward. So it might seem like a lot of work up front to get set up with a style guide, but as you'll see, they more than make up for it in the long term. So when you're working with a really big digital product, the design and the code can get out of sync very quickly. A style guide is a good check and balance. It's something that can be used to make sure that you're staying on track. And this is especially important if you have a sprawling site with multiple people working on it, like Starbucks. So they have a pattern library, and it's really fantastic that they've decided to make it public. It contains things like the grid system that they use, various layout modules, dialog boxes, and form styles. And this documentation is especially useful for when external teams are brought in to work on a site. Things like form validation styles can be reused, so Starbucks don't have to reinvent the wheel every time that they introduce a new section to the site, or worse, duplicate code that they already have. Interacting with inconsistent UIs across government websites is what spurred 18F to put together, in a relatively short space of time, the US web design standards. And it's so exciting to see governments focusing on this, not just as a way to make their sites less confusing to users, but also as a way to save public money, because they're not having to reinvent the wheel with every new site. And what they've put together is a set of common UI elements that have already been usability tested and meet accessibility standards out of the box. And these components are intended to be reused to maintain visual consistency across US government websites. Alongside the patterns are guidelines on how to adapt them in a way that maintains these standards. What's incredible is seeing a government write up and share their research, which then directly influences the decisions that another government webs team makes. So there's a Trello board for the minimum viable product of the US web design standards, and it's public, so you can see some of the discussions that went on into designing individual components, like their date picker, which they've actually based directly off one that gov.uk built and wrote about. And they're not just open sourcing their code, they're also open sourcing their workflow and their research. Another benefit that style guides have is that when you use them as part of your QA flow, because when everything is on one page, it's faster to test. You can easily spot style conflicts and quickly drill down to a specific element that's causing things to break. And you might even want to do visual regression testing on your style guide to see if a change has unintentionally affected any other patterns. So normally markup is hidden behind view source, but by displaying code on the page alongside the pattern, your team can spot errors in the code quite easily. And it's also going to encourage you to write better code if you're effectively showing it off to everyone. And another nice thing you can do is install a browser extension called Totally. That's with the L's replaced with ones, like A11Y. And that toggles common accessibility issues, like color contrast. So here it's flagging up where the text doesn't contrast enough with the background to be easily readable to people with low vision. Because all my patterns are in a style guide, I can test them all at once without having to go through every single page template that I've built. So when you're rapidly iterating, a lot of inconsistencies can creep in. So when you do a code review, having all your modules in one place helps keep track of what's new, what's a duplicate, and what's not being used anymore. So I talked earlier about Brad Frost's inventory, interface inventory. A pattern library is basically a built version of that. So Chris Coyer decided to create a pattern library of his app, CodePen. Even though he'd built the thing on his own, he was really surprised by just how many button styles that were used on his site. So doing an audit on your site is a great thing to do because a lot of these styles can be consolidated, and that way you end up with a more consistent design and leaner code. If you can build elements straight into code using something like style prototypes, you're giving a much more realistic representation of what a design is going to look and feel like. You can immediately show it on different devices and browsers and get an idea straight away of if something is going to work in practice. And you can get feedback on any issues early on with the designer. One of the best ways to make sure that your style guide is kept up to date is to have someone on the team who is an evangelist of it. So someone who keeps it in check and makes sure that new patterns are always added to it. And there's an entire team at Marriott Hotel who just maintain their style guides. While most places are unlikely to be able to justify that, having someone in your team who is in charge of regularly checking the style guide is kept up to date and being maintained and nagging others to contribute and refer to it is going to go a long way. So GitHub, as you know, they hire a lot of developers and they maintain their own standards for writing HTML and CSS, organizing files, and the reasoning behind why they do particular things in a certain way. This makes the onboarding process for new employees a lot easier because they can just point them to these documents, and because they're public, they might have already read them. Style guides can also be used to measure how much different features are going to affect performance. So Dan Moore worked with Tim Cadlick on Radio Free Europe's design. They were told that because of the nature of the content, some of the site's users had been jailed or even hanged just for accessing the site. So performance in this project was critical. They were thinking about it during the design phase as they were building up an element collage. When they started building, Tim created a grunt task that measured how fast each pattern was loading. And Lonely Planet, they also think a lot about performance. Each file has performance stats logged in the style guide, and changes to these are plotted on a graph so they can see which areas can be optimized to make the most impact. Since all of this is public, it also creates more of an incentive to optimize aggressively, and its prominent hopefully prevents file size from creeping up too much with each release. Pattern libraries are also a fantastic tool for rapid prototyping. So Federico, who works on MailChimp, he used theirs as a way to quickly build up new pages or update existing ones. And he managed to test out an idea that was using real code and was responsive in just 20 minutes. And he did this by slotting together existing patterns. But no matter how good your pattern library or documentation is, it's not a replacement for talking to the client or the rest of your team. This isn't just something that you're going to build, hand over, and that's it. So Dan Moore has adopted the goal that every deliverable that he hands over has to come with a proper conversation. Also, don't wait until the end of the project to build one. Start putting it together from day one. Otherwise, it's likely to be a snapshot in time that people are less likely to maintain because they don't feel invested in it. And this is why it's so important to get the designers involved in making and maintaining it, even if it's intended as a front-end development tool. Like Gina says, if it's not part of your workflow, you're asking for it to become outdated. That being said, you can still make one if the site already exists. So this is one I threw together for a list apart long after the site had gone live, just to keep track of what styles that there are. It's important to think about who you're building your style guide for. So is it for developers? Is it an editorial team adding content to a CMS? That will dictate what kind of a message that you choose to convey. And you should also consider how strict you want it to be. So are there a set of guidelines that are open to interpretation, or are they rules that have to be followed? And I tend to lean towards some more relaxed guidelines, but it will really depend on the project. So this is Code for America's style guide. Each design pattern that appears on the site is built in isolation, and multiple patterns can be assembled together like Lego blocks. They have a microsite for each city, so their guidelines are very relaxed because they wanted to allow people more creativity in appropriating their city's microsites to its individual needs and culture. So here's the information that's shown for each pattern. Each pattern has a unique name that the team can refer to. The pattern itself is displayed at full width, with the idea being that it can adapt and slot into any space. It has the code that you would need to write to reproduce the pattern, a description of when that pattern is appropriate to use. So here I'm explaining that this pattern should be used as a call to action, and a link to the pattern which is shown on its own page for debugging purposes. Each individual pattern is a discrete file, so everything is self-contained so that if the pattern becomes obsolete, the components can be removed easily. So if you're using Sass or Less for your CSS, these files should have the same name as the pattern files, so they're easier to find and so that you can see that matching files are related. The style guide uses a compiled version of the main site styles so that it's always the same as the website. But I also add some CSS just for the style guide, which I don't include in the production site. And I prefix all the class names in the style guide, so things like the pattern wrapper with .xx, just so they'll never clash with the main site styles. I then set up a function that loops through all of the pattern files and spits them out into one page. And I add things like color swatches and typography straight into the style guide, so as I'm not going to reuse these components anywhere on the production site. I then add some code to the function that outputs the markup for that pattern next to the pattern itself. And the width of the patterns should be independent of the layout so that you can fit them into any space. That way, if the layout changes, you won't have to update the patterns. They just work anywhere. And this technique is essential for responsive websites. So I've been working on my own Jekyll version of a pattern library. Jekyll is a static site generator that also plays really nicely with GitHub Pages, which hosts my site. So when I commit a change to the style guide, that change automatically gets pushed to the live site. The patterns live in a Jekyll collection, which means that I can loop through all the files and output them all on one page. And I've also added content in the YAML front matter of each file, which gets displayed as part of the pattern. I then have a grunt task that copies the pattern files into the includes folder, strips out the YAML, and that means that I can use exactly the same patterns on the site as are in the style guide. And that way my style guide is always in sync with my site. Brad Frost and Dave Olson have created Pattern Lab, which you might have heard of. It does a lot of really cool things, like letting you randomly change the width of a container and search for all the patterns. And it's an excellent starting point for a product. It uses PHP, but there are also ports for Node and .NET. And there are some other tools out there that will even generate a style guide for you based on comments in your CSS. So KSS, which is short for Knarl Style Sheets, does this with the aim to make your site easier to maintain. So you write comments in this way with all the various states, And KSS will look for these and generate a style guide from them all. It's actually, I really like this. I use this a lot for sites I build. Tools like Frontify do a similar job. So they generate a style guide for you, displaying things like swatches and typography used. They also have a discussion feature. And this is great if your team works remotely and you want to make communication as clear and collaborative as possible. It's so important that your style guide is available from outside the internal network, because often external agencies will need to use it. And people are also more likely to use it if it's easily accessible. So my favourite tool is Typecast, because it promotes a content-first approach. I'm not sure if this can really be called a style guide. It doesn't do stuff like generate colour swatches for you, but it's a great first step towards making one. It's purely for prototyping typography and helping build a solid foundation in the browser. So padding, margin and line heights can be tweaked, and it generates fairly decent CSS. As you know, Photoshop is terrible at showing what type will actually look like in the browser. So if you're a designer, please try Typecast instead. So there are a few key features that your front-end style guide should have, as well as a lot of optional ones. So before you do anything, just start with the basics. So raw HTML elements without any CSS classes, things like heading levels, default paragraphs, links, tables, form input boxes. And you can reuse this HTML on any project. And it's great to sit with a designer and just tweak things with them, like line heights, to make sure that you've got a really decent typographic grounding for the site. So I use Paul Lloyd's Bare Bones, which has all the raw HTML elements that you could possibly need, along with an explanation of when it's appropriate to use them. And the design is nice and minimal, so you might also want to use his CSS as a starting point. After you've put in some basic elements, start adding the patterns. So aim to only include the patterns that you need. It's really tempting to want to show everything in your boilerplate, but be realistic. While it's nice to have, most sites are unlikely to need a style for the keyboard element. I'm quite guilty of this, so I want to add everything I can think of in the style guide just in case, but it doesn't help make my code any leaner. So I have a toolbox at home, I'm sure you all probably do as well, that is just full of things that I don't use. It has multiple things that I have more than one of, parts for furniture that I don't own anymore, and things I've just kept in case I might need them. MailChimp's style guide says that they only add new patterns when there's a sound case for doing so, because new patterns come at a high cost in terms of design elements, additional code, and maintenance. And they also say that new patterns increase the cognitive load on users. And I get that cognitive load when I'm searching for a particular tool in my toolbox. They know that the more that they add to their pattern library, the more features they have to support, and the more complex the library and the site gets. So only add new patterns that are needed and remove old ones that aren't used anymore. Alongside your patterns, show the markup that's needed to replicate it. So this is Salesforce's, and they have fantastically detailed design system documentation. I like to put my code behind a show hide so that the page doesn't get too long, but Salesforce have so many patterns that they've actually split them into multiple pages. So they make all their markup visible on the page. This is usually HTML, but really it should be whatever language that the person who's building the site would need to recreate that pattern. So South Tees Hospital, their website is built in WordPress, so their code examples are WordPress shortcode. Someone without any knowledge of HTML can easily add components to a new page in WordPress in the editor view without having to open up a code editor. And it also means if the markup changes further down the line, the shortcode will stay the same and the patterns will still work. You may also want to show the CSS. Salesforce actually display the Sass that they use for their patterns. I wonder how useful this is because, unlike the markup, a pattern CSS in isolation is missing the global styles, so it's not possible to replicate it using just that snippet. but I guess it is useful as a learning tool for other people to see how it's made. Don't forget to show the extremes. So in this example, I've got a really long heading which I've put in to make sure that it doesn't look weird when the text wraps. Also show what happens when people do things that the designer might not have anticipated, like having two headings next to each other. As you go, check the patterns on different devices and browsers, and also make a habit of turning off JavaScript to make sure that your fallbacks work. Adding notes is especially useful for back-end developers who need to understand the logic behind certain styles. So here there are groups that could have any of 3 different styles to signify whether it's a public group, which is the default state, or a private group, or a group that the user already is a member of. So there are some notes explaining what these 3 different styles mean and when to trigger them. Colour swatches are a really nice thing to add to a style guide. For Code for America's style guide, each colour has its own name, hex code and RGB value. If I'm using SAS or less, I also like to include the variable name so that I can quickly reference it when I'm coding. And I like to ask the designer to choose these names because it's something they love doing and it helps them get invested in the style guide. Many style guides, like MailChimp's, document how to set up their grid. And it can take a while to set up this documentation the first time that you do it, but it's a solid investment because they can make building templates going forward so easy. They also force you to think about why you're building it in a particular way, which can in turn improve the quality of your design and code. I've seen some really lovely examples of grids in style guides, like Starbucks, which has a toggle for showing the grid as a layer, like you can do in Photoshop. And it's ideal for checking whether something is lining up properly. If you've got animations on your site, document these too to keep the styles and timings consistent and write up when to use particular ones. So Salesforce's style guide has a fascinating section on how they use animation. Google also have a fantastic guide called Material Design. That includes a lengthy animation section. Both Salesforce's and Google's are among the best examples of style guides that I've seen, so I highly recommend you check these 2 out. Something that is frequently neglected on a site is right-to-left styles. So for this style guide, I've added a right-to-left toggle, and that switches the text direction of all of the patterns. After a while, your style guide is going to get pretty long, so you might want to drop in some navigation like a jump link or select box or some navigation to the side. I prefer jump links just because I like my patterns to fill the entire width of the screen so that I can test that they respond nicely at very big screen sizes without the navigation getting in the way. A style guide that's out of date is almost as useless as no style guide at all. So the challenge for the coming months and years is making ones that are powered by the live site that use the same styles, the same content, and the same code base. So a lot of style guides are built separately from the site, and the code can get out of sync over time. So Gina calls these zombie style guides when they're unloved and unmaintained. Don't let your style guide become a zombie style guide. Lonely Planet have a really clever strategy to stop theirs becoming zombified. So they've hooked it up to an API, meaning that their markup used is synced with the live site. And they call their system Rizzo. So rather than have HTML snippets, they display the code that's needed to pull in the markup. So to show you an example, this code outputs a card with a cover image, and the parameters can be modified to change the output. So taking this example, if we wanted to show the same pattern but with an author credit, we can add a couple of lines for the author name and avatar, and they appear. And this tackles a problem where components may become out of date, such as if the markup changes. And it also means if you have multiple components that share a lot of the same markup, you're not duplicating the code. Ian Feather, formerly of Lonely Planet, he credits the success of their style guide to this API. and he mentioned that he'd built 2 versions of this one that became zombie style guides, but now it has an API, it's always up to date, and he doesn't have to actively maintain it. Even the best style guides can be improved, and it feels like everyone is still seeking that holy grail, even Ian Feather, formerly of Lonely Planet. The style guide that needs minimal maintenance, that everyone feels invested in, that's easy to update and that stays up to date, we're still seeking that. That's usually a lot easier for an in-house team to achieve than, say, an agency who hand a style guide over as a deliverable. So Dan Moore talked to me about baking in time after the project to revisit the style guides that they deliver. And I think this is brave because it's admitting that the system that they've delivered is probably not going to be perfect the first time round. And they use this time to see what's working, what's not working, how they can be improved, and make tweaks based on this feedback. And I think this should be true for any project. It's not right to just throw a bunch of documentation at a team, hope for the best, and then dust your hands of it. And I just want to stress the value of making it public. So other than being a nice thing to do that helps the community, there are some very good reasons for this. One is that it keeps you honest. You're going to be more likely to maintain the thing after other people can see it. And the second thing is that it's a recruitment tool. Several people that I've talked to have said that they've joined a company after seeing their style guide. So if you build one and it's good, you're going to have people like Gina knocking at your door. Lonely Planet Style Guide also has helped them with recruitment. And they're making their own tool, Rizzo, public and open source. And that means that some of their new recruits are already familiar with working with the tool before they've even started. And it also opens the doors to people outside of your organization to make improvements to your overall design and code. So a week after US web design standards went live, Maya tweeted that they'd merged 9 pull requests from people outside of government. My final piece of advice is don't be intimidated by how all these examples look. It doesn't have to be a work of art. That is not the point. Sure, it helps if it looks nice because people will feel more proud of it, but it's meant as a tool. Start small and simple, build upon it as and when you can. So if you want to know more, I've set up a repository on GitHub that brings together stuff about style guides, and it has over 300 resources that have been added by the community. You might want to check this out if you're looking for more ideas and inspiration on creating a style guide, or if you're using a particular language that you want to see if anyone else has done as well. I also ran a little podcast with Brad Frost all about style guides. It's just a short run thing with a total of 12 guests. A lot of the quotes in this presentation were directly from those podcasts. And I've also written a book about the topic. It's £2 and it goes into a lot more detail about everything I've just been talking about. Thanks so much for having me. I hope it was useful.